Imagine for a second that you could put on a pair of glasses, but instead of just sharpening your vision, they forced you to see the world through, like, dozens of different lenses,
Oh, wow. All at the same time.
all at exactly the same time. Yeah. So through one lens, you're looking deep into the isolated canopy of the Amazon rainforest.
Right.
And then through another lens, you're suddenly standing on this scorching, bustling sidewalk in South Florida, surrounded by a dozen different languages.
Which is a pretty jarring transition.
Totally jarring. And then through yet another lens, you are peering into, like, the darkest corners of human history. We're talking genocide, terrorism, the trauma of war.
Yeah, that would be entirely overwhelming for anyone. You'd be completely dizzy.
Exactly. But trying to see through all those lenses at once, it isn't just some abstract thought experiment. It is the literal daily reality for a certain kind of scholar.
Yeah, because it's an attempt to capture the human experience, not as, a single variable in a vacuum. It's about seeing it as this entire messy web. Because to understand how we live, how we fight, and ultimately how we survive, you really have to look at the architecture of the whole system.
And that is exactly what we are doing today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the massive academic universe of Dr. J.P. Linstroth.
Yes, his work is incredibly expansive.
It really is. And we have our hands on basically a roadmap for his project, which is called Epochal Reckonings. So every Friday, he releases a new discussion diving into his research.
Right, and the source material we're looking at today is essentially his intellectual blueprint. It outlines the entire scope of his work.
Yeah. And for you listening, unpacking this one prolific anthropologist's research interests, it's basically a masterclass. You get to see how different global struggles, different histories, and completely different cultures are just deeply and visibly intertwined.
So our mission today is to look at this web of topics and understand the underlying logic. We need to figure out why this specific, sort of eclectic combination of subjects matters so much to us right now.
Right. But before we even get into the heavy details of, like, what Dr. Linstroth is actually studying, I think we should look at how he is communicating it.
Oh, absolutely. The methods matter.
Because his methods provide a major clue about his philosophy. In the announcement we're looking at, he specifically notes that today he's translating a couple of his broadcasts into Spanish, Portuguese, and Basque.
Yeah, and those aren't just random language choices. They map directly to his geographic research areas.
Oh, so?
Well, he studies Brazilian history and Brazilian Amerindian history, which totally explains the Portuguese. And he studies the anthropology of Latin America and South Florida immigrants, which necessitates the Spanish.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And then he also highly specifically studies the Spanish Basques. So the Basque translation is key there.
Okay, let's unpack this, because translating academic papers into, a regional language like Basque,
Which has relatively few speakers globally.
exactly, compared to English or Mandarin, it sounds noble, it sounds great, but isn't it practically just an academic flex?
An academic flex.
Yeah. Like, I mean, is a working class community actually reading dense anthropological theory? Or is this just to score points in the university faculty lounge? Because he specifically lists engagement and applied anthropology as his research interests. Is a translation really proof of engagement?
Well, it's a fair question, for sure. But Linstroth's stated methodology here is applied anthropology, and that fundamentally aims to use anthropological methods to solve real-world problems.
Okay.
So in that framework, translating findings into Basque or Portuguese for Brazilian populations, it's an attempt to dismantle the ivory tower.
Ah, I see. So it's like a museum curator making sure the informational plaques are actually written in the native language of the artifact's creators, right? Rather than just whatever language the museum happens to be located in.
That's a great analogy, yeah. The premise of his project is that these cultures are not just data points to be extracted and analyzed by English-speaking academics.
Yeah.
By providing the research in their native tongues, he's attempting to give the subjects of his research a real seat at the table.
So they can actually participate in how their own history and culture are discussed globally.
Exactly.
So by prioritizing these regional languages, he's basically giving these communities a voice in the academic record.
Yes.
And giving them a voice is step one, because the actual histories of these specific communities, the Basques, the Amerindians, the immigrants, they're often defined by larger powers trying to silence them.
Which naturally brings us to the darker side of his work.
Yeah, they're really heavyweights. When you look at the theoretical themes he's tackling, I mean, we are talking about genocide, terrorism, conflict and peace.
Indigenous rights, immigrant rights.
Right. Inequality, social justice, it's intense.
What's fascinating here is that in the realm of political anthropology, you literally cannot study one of those without studying the others. They operate as an ecosystem.
What do you mean by ecosystem? Like they feed off each other?
Yeah, exactly. You cannot understand the mechanisms of genocide without understanding the mechanics of nationalist politics and ethnicity. You can't grasp the reality of indigenous or immigrant rights without studying systemic inequality.
So it's all connected.
Totally. What Linstroth is mapping out here is really an anthropology of human survival. He's examining the structural trauma populations inflict on each other and then the subsequent fight for justice.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Nestled right in the middle of all those aggressive, heavy terms is this other research interest he lists, which is history and memory. So if a researcher is diving into conflict and peace right alongside history and memory, are they essentially suggesting that our memories are what actually cause our conflicts?
Yes, and that is actually one of the most vital concepts in modern anthropology. Memory is rarely a perfect, objective recording of the past. It is a social construct.
Right.
How a group remembers an event often dictates their current political actions.
Walk me through how that actually works in practice, though. Like, how does a memory become a physical conflict?
Well, let's look at how historical grievances operate. Imagine a border dispute from 100 years ago where one community felt slighted or oppressed by another.
Okay, sure.
The objective historical facts of that treaty, they might just be buried in a library somewhere. But the collective memory of that event, how it's taught to children, how it's mythologized in local songs, how politicians weaponize it in speeches.
Right, it takes on a life of its own.
Exactly. That memory becomes a living thing. Terrorism, for example, rarely happens in a historical vacuum. It is frequently fueled by a collective memory of grievance, whether that memory is entirely factually accurate or heavily distorted over time.
Wow.
So by studying history and memory together with conflict, the framework acknowledges that the stories a society tells itself about the past are often the exact tools used to justify violence in the present.
The stories we tell ourselves dictate how we fight today. That is powerful.
Yeah, it is.
But to see where those concepts are actually deployed, we kind of have to shift from the abstract theory to the physical world, right?
Right. We have to look at concrete communities.
Because Dr. Linstroth takes these massive theories about genocide and peace, and he drops them into real places. For instance, he investigates the 19th century Brazilian rubber boom, and he goes incredibly deep into Amazonian Amerindian groups.
He really does.
And just to give you listening an idea of the sheer scope here, he specifically researches the Appprecciative, the Kambeba, the Kulkama, the Munduruku, the Mura, the Sateremawe, the Tukuna, and the Tucano. I mean, it's a huge list.
It is an incredibly diverse, complex array of indigenous life deep in the rainforest. And studying them in the context of the 19th century rubber boom is just a perfect way to look at the collision between ancient cultures and global capitalism.
Okay, let's unpack that collision. For someone who maybe isn't familiar with it, what exactly was the Brazilian rubber boom? And why does an anthropologist use it to study abstract concepts like inequality and social change?
Well, during the late 1800s, the invention of the pneumatic tire created this massive, sudden global demand for rubber.
Because of bicycles and early cars.
Right, exactly. And the Amazon was the primary source.
Right.
But extracting that rubber required immense labor. The boom resulted in the catastrophic exploitation of indigenous groups, like the Munduruku and the Sateremawe.
Oh.
They were subjected to forced labor, debt bondage, and just outright violence to extract wealth for international markets. It wasn't just a historical event.
It was a complete upheaval.
Yes, a violent structural reorganization of their society driven entirely by outside economic forces.
So when he studies those specific Amazonian groups today, he isn't just looking at, their traditional rituals in a vacuum. He is studying the generational trauma of that massive economic exploitation.
Precise.
But then on the exact same research list, he pivots entirely to modern urban diasporas. He studies South Florida immigrants, specifically Cubans, Haitians, and Guatemalan Mayas.
All right, the environmental contrast there is severe. I mean, you're looking at deep rainforest isolation and historical extraction on one side, and then hyper-modern, complex immigration hubs in Miami on the other.
It's like totally different worlds.
It seems like it. But both of these vastly different populations are actually case studies in migration and human rights.
Really?
Yeah. The Amazonian groups facing the devastation of the rubber boom We're dealing with globalization just as intensely as, say, a modern Guatemalan Maya immigrant navigating the complex legal and economic systems of South Florida today.
Huh.
The geography changes, right?
Uh-huh.
But the human struggle against massive structural forces remains the consistent thread.
You know, it's almost like zooming in and out on Google Earth. Like, you start with this satellite view of global political anthropology, and
Yeah.
then you drop a pin and zoom all the way down to the specific streets of South Florida, or, a village of the Sataré-Mawe in the Amazon. The terrain looks different, but you're still looking at the same planet.
That's a great way to think about it. And to navigate that map correctly, you need a very specific set of analytical tools. You can't just look at a complex culture and guess what's happening. You need a structural framework to decode it.
Which brings us to the invisible scaffolding of society.
Exactly.
Because when you look at the rest of Linstroth's research topics, you see the actual mechanics he uses to decode these communities. He lists cognition, urban anthropology, gender theory, globalization.
Economic anthropology, applied anthropology.
Right. And then also ritual and performance, material culture and media, and kinship.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, think of these concepts as the ultimate toolkit of the anthropologist. When we talked about the heavy concepts earlier, conflict, rights, justice, tolerance, those are the outcomes.
Okay.
The toolkit is how we explain why those outcomes happen.
Let's explain these like I'm five. Because throwing around terms like economic anthropology or kinship can get dense super quickly. What does kinship actually mean in this context? Because it's not just like drawing a family tree, right?
Not at all. Kinship is really about the fundamental building blocks of loyalty, obligation, and resource sharing in a community.
So how people rely on each other.
Yes. In an Amazonian tribe, your kinship network might dictate exactly who you share your hunt with, who you can marry, and who's going to protect you in a conflict. It's a survival mechanism.
Wow.
Now, take that exact same tool and apply it to an urban immigrant diaspora in South Florida. Kinship there might look like a network of extended family and neighbors who pool their money to help a new arrival pay rent.
Or a network that helps someone secure a job in a new city.
Exactly. The mechanism of kinship is identical in both places. It's the safety net that allows the group to endure.
That makes a lot of sense. And what about economic anthropology? Because I assume that means studying more than just Wall Street or the GDP.
Oh, for sure. Economic anthropology look at how human societies value, produce, and exchange goods, and how those specific systems shape their culture. It's looking at the human behavior behind the transaction.
Give me an example of that.
Well, in the context of the 19th century rubber boom, it explains how the global demand for a raw material completely dismantled local indigenous economies and replaced them with forced extraction.
Right.
But in the context of modern South Florida, economic anthropology might look at how Haitian immigrants navigate the system of remittance.
Remittance, like sending money back home.
Yes, sending money back to family in their home country. And it looks at how that constant outflow of capital shapes their social standing, both in Miami and back in Port-au-Prince.
Wow. So what does this all mean for the last two tools? I want to look at two specific ones he lists here. Ritual and performance, right alongside material culture and media.
Yeah.
If an anthropologist is studying both of these things as structural tools, is the implication that, like, the things we buy, the clothes we wear, and the media we consume on our phones today, are those functioning as modern versions of ancient tribal rituals?
In a structural sense, yes, absolutely. Yeah. In anthropology, a traditional ritual is basically a sequence of activities involving gestures, words, and objects designed to influence outcomes or reinforce beliefs.
Okay.
But if you strip away the mystical language, a ritual is fundamentally about signaling belonging, asserting status, and creating community cohesion.
So how does that map onto material culture and media? Like, give me an example of how media acts as a ritual.
Well, look at social media. When a teenager in South Florida buys a highly specific, culturally relevant brand of sneakers, which is material culture,
Right.
and then posts a choreographed dance on TikTok, which is media and media, they're engaging in a modern ritual.
That's wild to think about.
But it's true. They are performing a specific sequence of gestures and utilizing specific objects to signal their identity, secure their place within their social network, and navigate their hierarchy. They're participating in a ritual of belonging.
A TikTok dance as an anthropological ritual of belonging. It sounds wild at first, but it totally proves the underlying point of Linstroth's entire blueprint. Whether you are studying the Ticuna in the Amazon canopy or a Cuban immigrant in Miami, Human beings are fundamentally wired the exact same way. We just change the props.
We change the props, we change the languages, we change the geography. But that invisible scaffolding, the need for kinship, the drive to create memory, the friction of social change, that scaffolding is universal.
Yeah.
And that is exactly why a scholar can legitimately study the 19th century rubber boom and modern terrorism at the exact same time. They're just different expressions of the same human condition reacting to different pressures.
It really puts the sheer scope of this Epochal Reckonings project into perspective. I mean, we have barely scratched the surface of this announcement, and it's a great reminder that Dr. Linstroth is dropping new discussions on these massive topics every single Friday.
Yeah, his output is incredible.
At the end of his announcement, he expresses this deep, genuine gratitude to his patrons for supporting his work. And honestly, you can see why that support is needed. Trying to map out the entirety of human conflict, memory, and culture takes immense resources.
And for you listening, the major takeaway here is the absolute necessity of this kind of multidisciplinary approach. We live in an era of hyper-specialization, where people really only want to look at one tiny slice of the pie.
Right, it gets siloed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you cannot truly be well-informed about the world today if you only look at economics, or only look at history, or only look at media. You have to be willing to see how the history of the Amazon connects to the realities of South Florida and how human cognition shapes modern globalization. It's demanding, but it's the only way to see the truth of the picture.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Remember those glasses with the dozens of lenses?
Oh yeah, the dizzying ones.
Exactly. We've looked through the lens of language, the lens of historical trauma, the lens of the rainforest, and the lens of the modern city. And as we take those glasses off, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to chew on.
I love these. Let's hear it.
We talked about how Dr. Linstroth studies history and memory directly alongside heavy hitters like terrorism and nationalist politics. And we know that human memory is incredibly subjective. It's flawed, it's emotional, and it's easily manipulated. So as you look at the fierce, often violent conflicts that are shaping our modern world today, I want you to ask yourself, are these struggles actually driven by the objective historical facts of what happened in the past? Or are we tearing each other apart simply based on how our specific group has chosen to remember that history? Keep diving deep, and we'll catch you next time.